going to start back over with the Battle of Gettysburg, and we're going to talk about a couple of things. I did tell you yesterday that after the Union loss at Chancellorsville, President Lincoln turned to another commander to lead overall forces for the Union, and he picked General George Meade. And as President Lincoln was back in Washington changing commanders, Confederate General Robert E. Lee was marching the Confederate Army towards Pennsylvania with about 75,000 men. And Lee's strategy at this point is he wants to win a decisive battle on northern soil so he can destroy the Union's will to fight. And he thinks if he wins at Gettysburg, the Union will give up this ghost and they will be able to have their own country within the United States. Well, in June, late June of 1863, General Meade leaves Washington, D.C., comes through Maryland, marching 100,000 Union soldiers on what's going to be a collision course with the Confederates. And we said that the Battle of Gettysburg actually started on July 1st, 1863, with just a small skirmish just west of Gettysburg, right? We had a small group of Confederate advanced troops that were stationed just west of Gettysburg, and suddenly these Confederate soldiers were engaged by a small group of Union advanced troops who were in the area. And advanced troops are those troops, small groups, that go out and kind of scout out what's going on, okay? So these guys fight from about noon until 1 o'clock in a small skirmish, and by 1 p.m. after they fought for an hour, the skirmish between two small units turns into a full-fledged battle when reinforcements from both sides arrive. So the battle started, the skirmish started about noon. And about an hour later, this skirmish turned into a battle because reinforcements came from both sides. Now, during this skirmish, which turned into a bigger battle, General Lee and the main Confederate Army were 8 miles away, and General Meade and the main Union Army was about 30 miles away from that area. Now, it was during this first battle that we're talking about that started with a skirmish and went into a regular battle where Confederate General Richard Ewell and his troops were beating back the Union troops. They were putting it on them pretty good. And these Union troops started to retreat through the town of Gettysburg toward a ridge known as Cemetery Hill. So if they went through the town of Gettysburg, where did this skirmish start originally? Okay, up in this area here. Okay, so they're going through the town of Gettysburg. Now, where did these Union troops retreat to?
Cemetery Ridge.
Cemetery Hill or Cemetery Ridge, okay? Now, at Cemetery Ridge was a Union lieutenant by the name of Frank Haskell, who had stationed himself on the crest of Cemetery Hill or Ridge, and his plan was to organize these Union troops as they retreated up the ridge, right? And as the Confederate troops advanced towards Cemetery Hill, these retreating soldiers are scrambling to get up to what we call the high ground. So if you picture this in your mind, the Confederates are continuing to, continuing to advance, right? And the Union troops are fleeing up Cemetery Ridge. Well, Lieutenant Frank Haskell, who's there to organize these Union soldiers, gets them organized. He turns them around and has them face these Confederate soldiers that are advancing because he wants to repel that Confederate advance. And these Union soldiers turn around and they actually use the grave markers on Cemetery Hill to rest their rifles as they fire upon those advancing rebel troops. Now, at the same time this is happening, General George Meade places all Union forces across the long ridge stretching from Little Round Top all the way across Cemetery Hill, all the way to Culp's Hill. So those dashes that you see here are where General Meade stations those Union troops. That's where they're at, okay? That's what he does. Now, how long was that Union defense line? How long is this? Do you remember? About 3 miles, okay? About 3 miles, very good. And so the Union defense line is on high ground at about 3 miles long. Now, at this point in the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate General Lee can see that the Union has a huge tactical advantage because they hold the high ground on the approaching rebels. So at this point, General Lee makes the decision to try to take Culp's Hill from the Union. And Culp's Hill, of course, is this position right here. The reason he wants to do that is he wants to take this hill so he can fire cannons this way into Union lines. Does that make sense? So he wants to get the high ground here at Culp's Hill, put his cannons here, and fire into these Union lines. That's his goal there. Okay? Now, Lee orders General Ewell to take that hill, Culp's Hill, if practicable. Okay? He gives him that order. Well, he didn't realize that Ewell was going to make a decision that it wasn't practicable to take the hill. He assumed that when he gave Ewell that order that he would understand that's what he wanted done. Okay, does that make sense? Anyway, as a result of Confederate General Ewell's decision not to attack Culp's Hill, we don't gain any advantage the first day. But is Confederate morale high or low at that point? High. Even though we don't take Culp's Hill, they feel like they've won the day. So the Confederate morale is very high. So that's what happens on July 1st of 1863. We have a small skirmish between two groups of opposing forces, which turns into a bigger battle because of reinforcements. Then we have Meade taking the Union troops and putting them all along Cemetery Ridge, 3 miles in a defensive position, and Lee deciding that he wants to take Culp's Hill so he can attack from that hill. Hello? Hello? I do? Okay, thank you. Sage, do you have your father's keys? You would like? Lost without keys. Okay. Now, we look at day 2 of the battle on July 2nd. What's the target for the Confederates still? Culp's Hill. There are approximately 4,700 rebel troops that arrive right here, and you can see the dots at the base of Culp's Hill, because Lee still wants to take that high ground so he can use his cannons. Now, among those Confederate men who would be a part of that 4,700 would be a rebel soldier by the name of Wesley Culp, who had moved to Virginia as a youth and would now be fighting the Union to take his own family's land, because Culp's Hill actually belonged to his uncle, who was a member of the Union, or North, right? But he moved to Virginia, so he's fighting to take his uncle's land, which is just a little bit ironic. Okay? Then we talked about on day 2 of the battle that the Confederates outnumbered the Union. How much at Culp's Hill? What was the ratio? 3 to 1. So the Union's in kind of trouble if you look number-wise of securing, or keeping, not securing, but keeping Culp's Hill. Well, despite the fact they're so outnumbered, the Union fights hard to hold Culp's Hill, even though they're outnumbered 3 to 1. Now, where is General Lee and his soldiers at the time that other 4,700 other Confederates are trying to take Culp's Hill? Where are they at? They're at Little Round Top. And you can see it on your map there. At the same time, General Lee takes soldiers and attacks the Union line at a ridge known as Little Round Top. It was kind of a ridge within Cemetery Ridge, a high point. Okay? Now, at the end of the day, none of this really works very well, because they don't take Culp's Hill, they don't take Little Round Top, and so who still holds the high ground at Gettysburg? The Union. We talked about casualties on both sides were high after 2 days. Nearly 25,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the first day of battle on both sides. We broke it down to the Union lost about 14,000 casualties, and the Confederates 11,000 after day 2. Now, a couple of things happened on the evening of July 3rd, one from the Union side and one from the Confederate side. We'll talk about the Union first. What happened on the evening of July 2nd, 1963, or 1863? What did Union General George Meade do that evening? Anybody remember? He called all of his officers together in a small farmhouse, and he conducted what was known as a council of war. And they discussed things. They discussed opinions on the progress or lack of progress made by the Union. during the first 2 days of battle. They discussed how they were doing. And after this discussion on progress, General Meade does something that was very unusual. He asked his commanders for a vote on 2 opinions he has given him as far as what they should do on July 3rd. Should they retreat back to Washington, D.C. because they cannot win? Or should they stand and fight the Confederates to the bitter end? And historians argue that there are really 2 different sides to Meade's decision for a vote. Either he thought there were going to be a disastrous result for the Union if they fought that day, or he was doing something known as consensus building, allowing his commanders to have a lot of say in what the decision would be the next day. In any event, whatever he had in his mind, the vote of the officers was unanimous to stand and fight the rebels to the bitter end. Okay? So, on July 3rd of 1863, the Confederate morale continues to be high. Okay? Now, the thing that happens on the night of July 2nd on the rebel side is General Lee decides he's going to devise a battle plan, a 3-part strategy that he's going to take part on the 3rd of July. Now remember, General Lee believes that if he wins this decisive victory over the Union on July 3rd of 1863, that's going to secure the Civil War for the South, that they're going to win. So here he had a 3-phase plan. Phase 1 is he was continued to attack the Union forces at Culp's Hill, right? Because he wanted to secure that high ground for the Confederates. Phase 2 of his strategy is he was going to order Jeb Stuart and 4,000 cavalrymen on a wide sweep of attack behind enemy lines. And the 3rd phase is Lee and his troops were going to attack the Union defense line at the center of the ridge right here, and he was going to pinch them with Jeb Stuart, and they were going to separate the Union. They were going to split them in half, and he believed if they could do that, what would happen? What would the Union do? What would the Union do if they could split them?
Lose.
Well, they would retreat back to Washington, D.C. So, first phase, he's going to continue to try to take Culp's Hill because he wants to get that artillery on top of Culp's Hill. He wants to get that done. Second thing he wants to do is he wants Jeb Stuart's cavalry to come an end round behind Union lines, as you can see, and hit right in the center of the Union lines. And he's going to attack from the other side, a frontal attack, and he and Stuart are going to pinch the Union, split it in half, and he thinks they'll retreat. Okay? That's the plan. What time did his plan start on July 3rd, 1863? 5 a.m. in the morning at dawn. Now, while the Confederates are assaulting Culp's Hill, General Lee decides he's going to see if he can't batter up the Union center lines at the same time. He kind of wants to soften the Union defense lines prior to his frontal assault. Does that make sense? He wants to kind of bombard these Union lines, soften them up so that when he brings in his infantry, they're in disarray. So what does he do? He orders cannon fire from Seminary Ridge onto Cemetery Ridge. Can you see Seminary Ridge on your map? So he's ordering cannon fire. The problem was Lee misjudges the location of the Union troops. He didn't think that they would be right on the front edge of Cemetery Ridge. He thought they would be backed off. So they fire the cannons from Seminary Ridge over the top of Cemetery Ridge and basically hit nothing, right? Because all the soldiers are hunkered down right on the front of the ridge. So Lee's artillery basically is hitting harmlessly beyond those Union troops. So is he softening up this line right here at all that he wants to attack sooner or later? No, he's not. He thinks he is, but he's not, because he's not firing where these Union soldiers are. Well, back at Culp's Hill, the Union artillery, they have their cannons on top of Culp's Hill, and they are just crushing the Confederates, causing unbelievable havoc and carnage, killing a lot of rebel soldiers with the cannon fire. And the Confederate assault on Culp's Hill makes very little progress with great loss of what? Life, okay? Among the nearly 2,000 rebel casualties that were lost at Culp's Hill on the 3rd of July, 1863, was Wesley Culp himself, who died on the hill that bore his family name. Well, General Lee now begins phase 2 of his plan by ordering Jeb Stuart and the Confederate cavalry around Culp's Hill to strike at Union forces from behind their defense line. And scouting for the Union on the far edge of the battlefield was the Michigan cavalry. And they were watching Stuart's end run and seeing what they were going to do. So the Michigan cavalry, under the command of Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer, are really the only thing that stands between Stuart's cavalry and him accomplishing his goal to hit in the middle of the Union lines from behind. So General Custer, with just 400 men, orders his cavalry to attack Stuart's men, despite the fact that they were outnumbered 4,000 to 400. Well, Jeb Stuart witnesses this attack coming at him by the Michigan cavalry, but he's certain that this Union assault is a bluff, and as before they ever plunge into the Confederate cavalry, they're going to veer off, kind of like playing chicken, okay? Well, Stuart underestimated General Custer, and the Michigan cavalry dig in their spurs, and I mean, they charge at a full gallop and hit Stuart's cavalry hard, really hard. Well, finally, what happens is Custer, plunging into the cavalry, splits that regiment in half, and the Confederates do what? Retreat. So, here we are at 3 o'clock on July 3rd, 1863. General Lee is planning on his frontal infantry attack on the middle of the Union lines, but he's unaware that Jeb Stuart and the Confederate cavalry is retreating. So, nevertheless, he initiates phase 3. And he orders Confederate General George Pickett to lead a massive infantry charge of 13,000 men directly into the center of Cemetery Ridge or Hill. And you can see in the map where I put the arrow where Pickett is going to charge. But he's expecting Stuart to be on the other side, and he's not there. Now, the Confederates, as I mentioned yesterday, you can see by the dots, they're ordered to kind of pinpoint their infantry to kind of go toward the center. So they're spread out over a mile, but they're going to move in and eventually fight to get to the center there. Okay? Now, the specific point where they're to go, again, is where Jeb Stuart and his 4,000 cavalry should be attacking from the rear. So this is going to be a huge debacle. Now, this charge by General George Pickett, ordered by Robert E. Lee, will go down in American history as the infamous Pickett's Charge. Okay, I think that's where we left her, didn't we, yesterday? All right. Well, the Confederate line, I mentioned, stretched for over a mile. And they're marching across a farmer's field. What this is, that they're marching across here, is a Pennsylvania farmer's field. Okay, keep that in mind, because I think you'll be surprised who owned it. Okay? So they're advancing across the Pennsylvania farmer's field. Now, General Meade has done a good job here because he has predicted the exact point where Lee's going to attack. So the Union is prepared, and Meade is not going to be apprehensive to take action. That's been kind of the MO of these Union commanders. They're apprehensive. Who's the only Union commander that we've talked about that isn't very apprehensive? Grant, but he's never been overall commander. Okay? Well, Meade knows what's going on. He's predicted the exact point where Lee will attack, so he's going to be prepared. Well, as General Pickett and those Union forces, or excuse me, Confederate forces advance, the Union just batters them with cannon fire from Cemetery Hill. They got their cannons up on top of the hill, and they're just battering these Confederates like you wouldn't believe. Who is directing that artillery? Union Lieutenant Frank Haskell. He's on top of Cemetery Ridge or Hill, and he's ordering the artillery, Union artillery, to pound those Confederates as they are doing what? They're trying to break through those lines and get up Cemetery Hill and take over the whole thing. Okay? Well, despite the unbelievable carnage and loss of life, these rebels continue to march towards the ridge. This is kind of a really devastating thing. But they're not quitters. They just keep marching. And the Confederates actually reach a fence line which would be in reach of Union rifles. Prior to that fence line, could they shoot with their rifles and hit any Confederates? No, they were artillery firing on them with cannons. But these Confederates just keep coming. Even though they're getting just destroyed, they keep coming, and they reach this fence line, which is in range of Union rifles, which would mean that the Union would be in range of Confederate rifles also. So now they can shoot weapons at each other than cannons. Well, they figured that at this point, when the Confederates got to that fence line, they had suffered 50% casualties. They had lost half their men of the 13,000 that Pickett started with, right? Lost half to get to the fence line. I want you to think about this. If you're a Union soldier and you're on top of Cemetery Ridge and you've just been pounding these Confederates and you've wiped out 50% of their men and they still made it to the fence and now they're advancing past the fence towards you, what might you do? You might panic, thinking, holy moly. Well, the Union soldiers couldn't believe what they were witnessing, that they just kept coming, and they began to panic, and they began to retreat, which is what Lee really wanted, because didn't he want to bust through those lines? So here the Union starts to retreat. Who's at the top of the hill watching them retreat?
Frank.
What?
Frank Haskell.
Frank Haskell. And he orders those Union soldiers to turn around and get back to their skirmish lines. Skirmish lines is where you set up a defensive position and fire from. Well, they're panicking, and they start to retreat because here come these rebels, still unfazed by 50% casualties. And Union Commander Frank Haskell orders those Union soldiers to turn around and get back to their skirmish